They buried her alive, and they called it recovering. 3 years. 3 years behind the white columns of Blackwater Plantation, and not one soul in Charleston had asked the only question that mattered. Why does a woman who isn't sick need armed men at her gate? Amara Bennett knew the answer. She'd known it for months, ever since the night she found the truth. Her father had spent a fortune hiding. A truth so dangerous that when the storm finally broke over Savannah, she picked up a pen instead of a candle and wrote a letter that would either save a stranger's life or end her own. She had no way of knowing he would come himself. She had no way of knowing what it would cost either of them. Once he did, rain hit the tall windows of her room in sheets, and Amara didn't flinch. She'd stopped flinching a long time ago. Her left wrist ached in the cold the way old scars do, and she kept her sleeve pulled low the way she always did, not from shame, whatever her mother wanted people to believe, but because the scar was hers, and Blackwater had already taken everything else. For nearly 3 years, this plantation had been her family's answer to an embarrassment they couldn't explain away. To Charleston society, Amara was fragile, recovering from a nervous condition, tucked out of sight for her own good. The truth was simpler. She had asked too many questions, seen too much, and her family had decided silence was easier than honesty. So they built her a beautiful cage, marble floors, gardens clipped into perfect obedience, black cars that never left without a reason, servants who smiled at her and reported everything to her father by morning. Amara had learned to survive it the only way she knew how, by watching. She memorized which guards changed shifts at midnight. She learned the sound a car made arriving unannounced. She noticed the ledgers her father kept locked behind a false panel in his study, and one rain-soaked evening 2 weeks ago, while the house slept, she finally opened it. What she found wasn't just money laundering, it was worse. Weapons moving through the family's private docks under shipping manifests that lied. Payments routed through accounts that didn't officially exist, and a name, circled twice in her father's own hand, that made her blood go cold even though she'd never heard it spoken above a whisper inside these walls. Lucien Devereaux. They called him the Black King, in rooms where people were too afraid to use his real one. Amara didn't know his face. She hadn't needed to, until tonight, because buried in her father's documents was a date, a shipment, a signal disguised as routine cargo, and it all pointed to the same terrible conclusion. Someone was going to kill him, soon, and whoever was feeding the assassins his movements wasn't some outsider. They were close enough to hear him breathe. Amara had no one left to tell. Not her mother, who had signed away her daughter's freedom without a second thought. Not the authorities, who took her father's money every Christmas. Not a single person inside Blackwater who didn't answer to the man she was about to betray. So she did the only thing left to her. She lit a single candle, sat at the small desk by the window, and wrote to a man who terrified an entire city. She didn't beg. She didn't explain who she was. She told him plainly that the danger wasn't outside his organization. It was already inside it, and that she had proof. She gave him one instruction, nothing more. Come to Blackwater Plantation before midnight, if you want to see the week's end. She signed it A.B., folded the letter twice, and pressed it into the hand of the one servant at Blackwater. She still trusted, praying it would reach the city before dawn. Then she sat back in the dark and told herself nothing would come of it. Men like Lucien Devereaux did not answer letters from strangers. At 11:58, headlights broke through the rain. Amara rose and crossed to the window in time to see 3 black SUVs sweep through the gates, tires cutting through standing water, engines shattering. 3 years of silence. She watched the rear door of the lead car open. She watched a man step out into the storm as though the weather itself had been warned not to touch him. For 3 years, Blackwater had been the place her family sent her to vanish. She understood, standing frozen at that glass, rain streaking the world outside into a blur of black and gold light. She had just made sure it would never be that again. Lucien Devereaux stepped out of the car into the rain, and for a moment he let himself remember exactly why he was here. 6 hours earlier he had been standing in a marble ballroom on the other side of the state, glass of scotch untouched in his hand, listening to men who feared him try very hard not to show it. Senators, shipping magnates, a judge who owed him more than he could ever repay. They orbited him the way weak things orbit anything powerful, smiling, agreeing, offering nothing real. Nobody in that room knew him. That was the arrangement. Fear didn't require intimacy. And Lucian had built his entire life around the distance between the two. He was good at being unreadable, good at standing in rooms full of people convinced they understood exactly what he wanted, when in fact he wanted almost nothing from any of them anymore. Power had a way of narrowing a man's interests down to survival and boredom, and somewhere in the last few years, the two had started to feel like the same thing. Then Marcus, his security chief, had crossed the ballroom with a folded letter and an expression Lucian didn't like. This came through the Savannah drop. No return address. Handwriting's a woman's. Lucian had opened threats before. Extortion attempts. Love letters from strangers who thought fear was the same thing as attraction. He expected another version of the same tired thing. Instead, the first line stopped him cold. Someone close to you has sold your life. No greeting, no plea. Just a fact stated as flatly as a weather report, followed by details that made his jaw tighten. A shipment date only 4 people alive should have known, a route he'd changed personally 2 weeks ago. A name he trusted that appeared nowhere in the letter, but hovered over every line like an accusation. Whoever had written this wasn't guessing. They knew his organization from the inside, or close enough to it that the distinction barely mattered. Marcus wanted to send a team to Savannah to secure the writer and bring back answers by morning. Lucian said no before he'd finished the sentence, because that was the part that actually held his attention, not the threat itself, which he could survive, but the writer. No demands, no fear in the phrasing, no attempt to flatter or soften him. Whoever AB was, they'd risen to the most dangerous man in the state, like they had absolutely nothing left to lose. Lucian didn't send men to solve mysteries that threatened his own life. He never had. It was the one rule that had kept him alive this long. If something wanted him dead, he looked it in the eye himself. So, he set down the scotch, told Marcus to get the cars ready, and left the ballroom without saying goodbye to anyone in it. Now the rain was hitting his shoulders, and Blackwater Plantation rose in front of him, beautiful, guarded, and clearly built to keep something in rather than keep the world out. His men fanned out around the car. He straightened his cuffs, unbothered by the storm, and walked toward the house like the weather had been warned in advance not to touch him. Inside, behind a rain-streaked window, Amara watched him come. She had built a monster in her head for 2 weeks, something cruel-eyed and violent, a man whose reputation alone could level a city block. Instead, she saw controlled stillness, tailored pale suit, black shirt beneath it, dark hair slicked back despite the rain, ink visible at his collar and the backs of his gloved hands. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He moved like a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry. The front doors opened before he reached them. Who wrote the letter? His voice filled the hall without rising. Amara stepped forward before her fear could stop her. I did. She watched his men exchange glances, waiting for him to dismiss her outright. He didn't. He studied her instead, her face, her posture, the way she didn't flinch under his attention, and then his gaze dropped, briefly, to the scar at her wrist she'd forgotten to hide. He didn't look away from it in pity. He looked at it the way he'd looked at the letter. Who put you here? Not what's wrong with you. Not the question every servant, every doctor, every relative had asked her for 3 years. Who did this to you? Amara handed him the folder of documents without answering. He read in silence, and halfway through, something in his expression changed. Recognition, sharp and unwelcome. A shipment number he clearly knew by heart. This is real, he said quietly, almost to himself. It is. Amara held his eyes. And the person who wants you dead isn't outside your organization. She let the silence stretch 1 second longer than was comfortable. He's inside it. Is inside it. Hung in the hall a moment too long before Lucian moved. Show me everything, he said. Not a request. Amara didn't argue. She'd been waiting 3 years for someone to ask. She led him past the grand staircase, through a service door disguised as paneling, into a narrow corridor no guest of Blackwater had ever seen. Lucian's men fell into step behind them, but Lucian himself stayed close at her shoulder, close enough that she felt the effort in it, a man built for entering rooms first, deliberately letting her lead. My father thinks I only found the study, Amara said. stopping at a wall that looked, to any eye but hers, entirely solid. She pressed her palm against a seam invisible in the plaster, and it gave, swinging inward onto a narrow room lined with filing cabinets and a second set of books that would never see an accountant's desk. He doesn't know I found this 3 years ago. Before he even sent me here, he spent all this time hiding things from a daughter who already knew. Lucian scanned the room slowly. Ledgers with 2 columns of handwriting, coded entries, a wall map of the private docks marked with dates that meant nothing to an outsider and everything to him. You've been documenting this the entire time you've been locked up. I had nothing else to do. She said it flatly, but he heard what she didn't say, that watching her family's crimes had been the only thing keeping her sane. He looked at her a beat longer than the moment required. They were halfway through the shipping records when a voice cut through the room like a slammed door. Amara, what is the meaning of this? Her father filled the doorway, dressed for an evening he clearly hadn't expected to be interrupted. His eyes went to Lucian, then narrowed with practiced concern as they landed on his daughter. Mr. Devereaux, I don't know what my daughter has told you, but she hasn't been well. Delusions. Paranoia. It's why she's been here. She's shown me shipping manifests with your signature, Lucian said, unmoved. Dated 3 weeks ago. Fabrications. She's clever with paper. Always has been. It's part of the illness. Amara didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. March 14th, 40 crates, listed as agricultural equipment, routed through Dock 4 instead of the main terminal you always use for legitimate cargo. You changed the manifest yourself because Dock 4 doesn't require customs inspection. Her father's mouth opened. Nothing useful came out. Ask him, Amara said to Lucian, why an unstable woman would know that detail and he wouldn't deny it. Lucian watched her father's silence answer the question for him. Something in his chest shifted. Not surprise exactly, but the specific respect a dangerous man reserves for someone more precise than he expected. Her father left without another word, which told Lucian everything the ledgers hadn't. Within the hour, his men returned from the docks, with confirmation worse than the paper trail. Concealed compartments beneath Dock 4, built into the pilings themselves. Rifle casings packed inside crates that had supposedly shipped tractor parts to 3 different states. This wasn't laundering anymore. Bennett wasn't just protecting a business partner. He had built an entire alliance designed piece by piece to bury Lucian for good. Back in the hidden room, alone now, Amara sat down heavily for the first time all night. He kept me here because I know too much, she said quietly. Not because I'm sick, because if I ever left, I'd say it out loud. Lucian's eyes went without permission to her wrist. She caught him. Go ahead. Everyone else does. Her voice had an edge now. Tired rather than sharp. They tell people I did this to myself, that I'm unstable. It's easier than explaining what actually happened here. I'm not asking what's wrong with you. His voice dropped, low enough that it belonged only to the room. I already know what happened to you. You survived it. She didn't answer. Their hands were both resting on the same ledger, close enough that when she reached to turn a page, her fingers brushed his. Neither moved away first. It was the first time in years anyone had looked at her without deciding in advance what she was. His phone lit up before either of them could name what had just passed between them. He read it once, jaw tightening. The assassination had been moved up. Tomorrow night. He was still absorbing that when a second message landed, and this one drained the color from his face entirely. Someone had accessed his private security files. Tonight, from inside this house. Lucian looked up slowly, scanning the room. The men stationed at the door, every face he'd trusted enough to bring here. The mole wasn't somewhere out there anymore. He was already in the room. Lucian gave the order before the message had finished loading on his screen. Nobody leaves Blackwater. No calls out. No cars. Nobody. His men sealed the house within minutes. Doors watched. Phones collected. The storm outside suddenly matched by something colder moving through the halls. Amara felt the shift immediately. The plantation that had been her prison for 3 years had become something else entirely. A room with the exits removed and a traitor breathing somewhere inside it, close enough to have heard every word they'd said to each other tonight. She sat with Lucian in the hidden accounting room while his men worked the breach from every angle they had. It was Amara, not any of them, who found it. Here, she turned one of her father's ledgers toward him, tapping a line of coded correspondence. This phrase, Confirm the window closes as planned. I've seen it before, almost word for word, in a letter my father received 2 months ago. Not from a stranger, from someone signing only with initials. Someone he clearly already knew well enough not to need an introduction. Lucian read it twice. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Whoever wrote that letter to your father, he said slowly, had access to language only my people use. That phrasing isn't Bennett's, it's mine. The silence that followed was worse than anything either of them had said aloud. By morning, the list of suspects inside Lucian's organization had narrowed to one name. Neither of them wanted to say. Marcus, his security chief, the man who'd stood beside him for 11 years, who knew every route, every safe house, every schedule Lucian had ever kept. The man who had, Lucian remembered now with a sick clarity, grown up 2 counties from the Bennett estate. It's not possible. Lucian said more to himself than to her, though even as he said it, small details he'd never questioned before started rearranging themselves in his memory. A cancelled trip, a convenient absence. The schedule change Marcus alone had suggested 3 weeks ago. Amara didn't push. She understood exactly what it cost him to even consider it. She recognized the particular loneliness of being betrayed by someone whose loyalty had once felt like the one certainty in the world. Her family had taught her that lesson at 14. Watching Lucian learn it now in real time, she felt something unexpected, not pity, but kinship. I know what it's like, she said quietly, to realize the people closest to you were never who you thought. He looked at her for a long moment and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound smaller than what she'd just given him. The test came that afternoon. Marcus proposed a routine security meeting at a warehouse 20 minutes from Blackwater. Standard, unremarkable, the kind of logistics call Lucian took weekly. Amara, reviewing the schedule over his shoulder, went still. The timing's wrong, she said. You changed your Tuesday routes 2 days ago. This meeting was set before that. Whoever approached it didn't know you'd already moved your schedule, which means they're working off information that's now out of date, unless someone updated them since. Lucian changed the location within the hour, telling no one but his driver. The warehouse he was supposed to have been in exploded 40 minutes later. He stood in the rain outside Blackwater afterward, staring at nothing, and understood with total clarity that the woman beside him had saved his life on nothing but instinct and a line of handwriting. He found her alone in the library soon after, still shaking slightly from adrenaline she wouldn't name. Why, he asked, would you risk yourself for me because you were the first person who believed me? No. His voice was quieter than she'd heard it. You gave me proof. I believed the proof. I'm only beginning to believe you. The Tao. He crossed the room and, without asking, reached for her scarred wrist, the one she always kept covered, the one her family had used against her for 3 years. She flinched, tried to pull back out of habit alone. He didn't force it. He simply held on gently and said, You don't have to hide this from me. She let him. It was the first time in years anyone had touched that scar without wanting something from her in return. Neither of them spoke. The rain kept falling. Then a guard burst through the door, breathless. Sir, Bennett's men. We've spotted vehicles approaching the front gate. A lot of them. Lucian's eyes moved to the dark windows where the storm hid everything except the truth. They knew where he was. The hunt had followed him to Blackwater. The gates gave way before the guard finished his sentence. Headlights tore through the rain, then gunfire, then the particular chaos of a plantation built for beauty, suddenly asked to withstand war. Lucian's men scattered into position along the courtyard. Return fire cracking through the storm. Thunder swallowed half the noise. The other half was screaming. Muzzle flashes lit the marble columns in flashes of white, and rain turned the courtyard stones slick with something darker than water. Get her inside. Lock the east wing. Lucian didn't look at Amara when he said it. He was already moving toward the fight, already someone else. A man built for exactly this. Amara made it 3 steps toward the east wing before she stopped. She wasn't going to hide in a house that had already hidden her for 3 years. She went for the study, instead cutting through the servants' corridor she knew better than anyone alive, and found her father already there, not fleeing, not afraid. Standing over an open drawer with a lighter in his hand and a stack of documents he clearly intended never to exist by morning. You did this, he said, not turning around. You brought war to our house. You brought it, Amara said. Years ago. I just stopped helping you hide it. He turned then, and for the first time in 3 years she saw something other than contempt on his face, something closer to fear, though not. She understood immediately. Fear for her. Do you understand what you've destroyed? Everything I built. Everything you built on dead men and stolen shipments. Her voice didn't shake. She'd spent 3 years rehearsing this without knowing it. You locked me in this house because you were afraid of what I'd say if I ever got out. Not because I was sick. Because I was right. Nobody would have believed you. He said it almost gently. The cruelest tone he had. The same tone he'd used for 3 years to explain away her isolation to everyone who'd asked. A locked-away girl with a scarred wrist and a nervous condition. Who exactly did you think would listen? He did. She didn't need to say the name. Her father's face told her he understood exactly who. The floor shook before he could answer. An explosion tore through the lower level, close enough that the windows blew inward in a shower of glass and rain. Her father bolted, documents forgotten, running for the nearest exit as fire began climbing the curtains behind him. Amara didn't run. The original ledger, the real one, the one that named the mole, the shipment, the assassination itself, was still hidden behind the false panel 2 rooms away. Everything else in this house was copies, distractions, the paper trail her father had built to protect himself. This was the only one that would survive a courtroom or a war, and she wasn't leaving it to burn. Smoke was already thick in the hall by the time she reached it. She pressed her palm to the seam in the wall, wrenched it open, and pulled the ledger free just as the ceiling above her groaned. She didn't have time to move. The collapse came fast. Plaster and burning timber crashing down between her and the door, pinning her leg beneath a fallen beam. Smoke pouring into what little space remained. Heat pressed against her skin like something alive. She coughed, clutched the ledger to her chest, and called out, though she wasn't sure anyone could hear her over the fire. And for one long moment, she understood with strange clarity that she might die in the exact room her family had tried to erase her from. Outside, Lucien had just put down the last of the men who'd breached the gate when one of his own grabbed his arm. The house? It's coming down. We need to pull everyone back. Where's Amara? Nobody answered fast enough. She went for the study, someone finally said. The ledger's in there. Lucien looked at Blackwater burning against the black sky. Flames climbing the east wing, smoke pouring from windows that had once watched Amara stand imprisoned behind their glass. The ledger was everything. Proof. The mole's name, the end of Bennett's empire, and the survival of his own. Biel, he had spent his whole life protecting what he'd built. The shipments, the accounts, the empire that made men afraid to say his name. None of it meant anything measured against the sound of her voice calling out from inside a burning house. Then he was running toward the fire. Sir? Someone shouted after him. Something about structural collapse, about it being too dangerous, about the building not holding. Lucien didn't slow down. The evidence could burn. He walked into the burning plantation without looking back. Smoke swallowed the hallway whole, and Lucien moved through it blind, one hand tracing the wall, the other braced against heat that seemed to come from every direction at once. Amara? Nothing. Then, faint through the roar of the fire, here the study. He found the door half collapsed, timber and plaster blocking most of the frame, and shoved through it with his shoulder until it gave. Inside, she was pinned beneath a fallen beam, one arm curled protectively around the ledger against her chest, smoke thick enough that he could barely make out her face. Take it, she said, pushing the ledger toward him the second he reached her. The evidence, it's everything. It's proof. Take it and go. No. He was already working the beam off her leg, ignoring the way the wood scorched his palms through his gloves. Lucien, it names the mole, the shipments, everything if this burns, not more than you. His voice left no room for argument. He freed her leg, pulled her up against him, and didn't look back at the ledger even once. She was the one who scooped it up herself before he lifted her off the ground entirely. The corridor back was worse than the one he'd come through. Flames had climbed the east wall in full now. Curtains gone to ash, one of the tall windows exploding outward from the heat and scattering glass across the floor in a shower that caught the firelight like something almost beautiful. Rain poured through the shuttered frame, hissing where it met the flames. Lucian carried her through it without slowing, ducking beneath a support beam that groaned overhead, cutting through what had once been a hallway of portraits now curling black at the edges. Behind them, a section of the ceiling gave way, with a sound like the whole house exhaling, plaster and timber crashing down exactly where they'd stood seconds before. They broke through the front doors into the storm together, and the rain hit them like something merciful. Lucian set her down on the whetstone just far enough from the house to be safe, and they both turned to watch Blackwater burn. The mansion that had held her prisoner for 3 years now collapsing in on itself, flame and smoke pouring into a sky just beginning to lighten at its edges. Amara was shaking, and not entirely from the cold. "Why?" she finally asked. "Would you do that? The ledger could have saved your entire organization." Lucian looked at her for a long moment, rain running down a face that had, for the first time all night, stopped being unreadable. "I came because of your letter." A pause, quieter than anything he'd said to her yet. "I stayed because of you." Neither of them moved to say anything else. It didn't need saying twice. It was one of his own men who broke the moment, dragging a struggling figure out from the tree line, where he'd been caught trying to slip away in the chaos. Marcus. Lucian crossed the courtyard slowly. "Going somewhere?" "Tussit. Tussit system textu." Marcus said nothing, but his silence was confession enough. And when Lucian's men searched him, they found what remained of the proof: payments from a Bennett account, communications matching the phrase Amara had caught in the ledger days ago. 11 years of trust, undone in the space of one burning night. "You could have told me," Lucian said quietly. "Whatever they offered you." Marcus still said nothing. There was nothing left to say that would matter. By the time the sky had turned fully grey with morning, Blackwater was little more than smoking ruins and blackened columns, and the assassination plot that had started it all lay exposed in full: names, dates, the mole, the alliance, all of it, finally in the light. Lucian turned to Amara. "Come with me. Somewhere safe, somewhere far from all this." She shook her head, and he watched her decide something in real time. "I'm not running from one powerful man's house into another's protection." Her voice was steady, despite everything the night had cost her. "I need to face what's left of my family myself, not as someone being rescued, as someone taking back what's mine." Lucian studied her, and something in his expression eased into something closer to respect than surprise. "Then I'll stand beside you while you do it." Not in front of her, not behind her, beside her. They stood together at the edge of the ruins as the sun finally broke over what remained of Blackwater. Scorched columns, collapsed roofline, the prison that had held her finally reduced to ash and steam. "What will you do now?" Lucian asked. Amara looked at the wreckage of everything her family had built to keep her small, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel afraid of the answer. "Take back what they stole." The ledger did what 3 years of silence never could. Within a week, federal investigators had everything they needed: names, dates, shipment routes, the coded correspondence linking her father to the rival organization that had tried to kill Lucian, and the full extent of a weapons network that had run through Bennett docks for longer than Amara had even suspected. Her father's allies scattered first, then turned on each other, then on him, each one racing to hand over evidence before someone else did it for them. The rival organization Lucian had spent years watching from a careful distance collapsed within a month, undone by its own paper trail. Marcus was gone from Lucian's world entirely, his name now spoken only as a warning to the next man who might consider selling out a king. The assassination that had once been 72 hours from succeeding never happened at all. Amara didn't disappear back into whatever quiet corner her family might have preferred for her. She did the opposite. She stepped forward. Within weeks, she had taken control of every legitimate Bennett holding still standing. The shipping contracts that weren't fronts, the real estate that wasn't a laundering shell. The business her grandfather had actually built with his own hands before her father buried it under crime. She separated what was clean from what wasn't, publicly, deliberately, letting Charleston watch her do it, line by line, meeting by meeting. The woman they'd been told was too fragile for society sat across from lawyers and board members, and didn't blink once. Her father tried, once, to stop her. He came to what remained of the family's Charleston offices, dressed like a man who still believed his name carried weight. "Without the Bennett name behind you," he said, "you're nothing. You always were. I gave you everything, and you tore it down." Amara didn't raise her voice. She'd learned, over 3 years of silence, exactly how much louder calm could be than shouting. "You didn't hide me because I was weak," she said. "You hid me because I knew who you were. That was never about protecting me. It was about protecting yourself from me." He had nothing left to say to that. He left. And this time, it was Amara who decided he wouldn't be welcomed back. Lucian watched all of it from a careful distance, present when she wanted him, absent when she needed the room to herself, never once trying to fold her into his world instead of letting her rebuild her own. It was, Amara realized slowly, the first time in her life a powerful man had stood near her without trying to own her. One evening, weeks after the fire, he found her on the terrace of the rebuilt Bennett offices. City lights spread out below where Blackwater's smoke had once hung. "You don't need my protection," he said, coming to stand beside her, not in front. "You've made that clear enough for anyone paying attention." She almost smiled. "Is that an observation or a complaint?" "Neither." He turned to face her fully. "But if you want my hand beside yours, it's yours. Not because you need it, because I'd rather stand next to you than anywhere else I've ever stood." Amara looked at him for a long moment, weighing it the way she weighed everything now, carefully, on her own terms, without fear driving the decision. "Yes," she said simply. He reached for her wrist then, the scarred one, the one her family had spent 3 years using to diminish her. She didn't pull away this time. She let him see it fully, uncovered in the light, and when he traced his thumb once over the old scar tissue, it didn't feel like pity or curiosity. It felt like being known, fully, by someone who had chosen to stay anyway. She turned her hand and laced her fingers through his instead. Months later, Amara stood at the newly rebuilt gates of what had once been Blackwater Plantation. Not the mansion which she had chosen not to rebuild, but the land itself, now marked for something she was still deciding how to become. She thought of the woman who had once stood behind these same gates, watching black cars come and go, invisible to a world that had been told she didn't matter. She walked through the gates now, instead of watching them from a window. Her head was high. Her sleeve was pushed back, scar uncovered in the sunlight for anyone to see. Lucian walked beside her, not in front, not behind, exactly where he'd chosen to stay since the night the house burned. They had hidden Amara Bennett because they believed she was their greatest weakness. They never imagined she would become the greatest strength of the man they feared most.